The question of the week is supported by Summer Pops. Principles: when students practice math over the summer, math scores go up. It's easy, effective, and affordable. Check out summerpopsworkbooks.com. And now,
Jen.
Will, why don't you tell us the question of the week?
Well, the question of the week this week, before we jump into this week's conversation with my great friend Cale Birk, the Q&A this week is how can leaders feel heard and ensure that responses lead to meaningful change rather than seeming like a waste of time? Somebody who wrote this question feels frustrated. So again, a lot of the questions I'm receiving here, Jen, are from surveys that I send out after training. So I'm going to read that one more time. How can leaders feel heard and ensure that responses lead to meaningful change rather than just seeming like a waste of time?
Yeah, I read this question. I'm glad you read it twice because I read it about four times. And I think the frustration from this question asker is actually pretty reciprocal for both the leader and the person that the leader is leading.
Mm.
So it sounds like the leader wants to feel heard, but it also sounds like, listen, as I lead, I want it to lead to meaningful change rather than waste everyone's time. And so there's a lot of ways we can go with this conversation, Will, but I think if we want to feel heard, we have to make sure we only speak, say, act, do things that matter and
Mm.
things that we want to be heard. Um, when we do that, then people are listening and then it will lead to meaningful change.
Mm.
So I guess as I think about mistakes I've made in my own leadership, some of those mistakes are using, too many words, staff meetings that don't matter, emails I didn't need to send, filling up others' headspace with things I didn't even care about or didn't matter. And so when I filled up others' headspace with that stuff, then it it really dulled my impact. And therefore, when I actually did want meaningful change, I didn't have the audience for it. So I
Mm.
think we have to be really careful with when we use our voices. I have a colleague, his name's Matt. He is a man of very few words, but when he speaks, my friends, you listen because he's thought about it. He is careful to use his allotted airspace, so to speak, and it's always on point.
Mm. Okay, I'm going to add three thoughts to that, Jen. That's so good. One is think about vetting your conversations before you have them. And I'll give you an example. In my final years as a principal, I started a habit that I wish I'd started years before. And that was the week prior to my next faculty meeting, I would bring in some leaders for lunch and say, hey, here's the agenda that we're looking at for next week's faculty meeting. What do you think about it? That's all I had to ask. And they would save me so much time because they'd be like, Will, don't talk about that. We've talked about that so many times. Or do you realize this needs to be talked about? And you don't even have that on the agenda. Or you maybe want to tweak this or don't. And so by the time I'd finished running it by vetted leaders, I had a much better agenda and we had taken out the waste time stuff. Two, um, limit the numbers of times you communicate. So
Mm-hmm.
don't every single time you have a thought, you don't need to send an email or call somebody or make an announcement.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes just keeping a list of those things that need to be said until an opportune time to say them so that people aren't exhausted by over communication. And then I'll give you one other tip that a friend of mine, my former principal used to use, and she called it the glance communication. If you email something that someone has to scroll to read, they're not going to read it. So
Mm-hmm.
so think about what's that most important thing that needs to be said that can't be scrolled past.
Right.
And that's hard because I'm a talker and I want to say it all. And so but getting it down to a place that's just really quick and understandable can be helpful too. So those are some thoughts I'd add.
Absolutely. And I think that internal question, I've tried to get a lot better at this over the years, just saying, do you need to say anything? What's it going to contribute? There's a great elementary school trick too that if you say something and it can't change anything within 5 minutes, then maybe you hold on it and think about a better way to say it later.
Mm, mm. So
There you go.
sometimes saying nothing at all
Yes,
can be really
exactly.
helpful. Well, we're going to stop right there then. Jen
Okay.
Schwanke, thanks for this Q&A time. Thanks to summerpopsworkbooks.com for sponsoring our Q&As. And Principal Matters listeners, you can always find free resources like this one at my website at williamdparker.com. And Jen, where can they find your resources?
They can find me at jenschwanke.com or email me at jen@jenschwanke.com. And I'm so excited to hear your interview today, Will, with Cale Birk.
Me too. Principal Matters Podcast, episode 430. Hi, friends. Can you believe it, Cale? Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your school leadership. And this week, I'm with my special guest, Cale Birk, as we talk about culturizing for impact. Cale Birk is a former teacher, high school principal, district head of innovation from British Columbia, Canada. In 2015, one of his schools was named one of the first model PLC schools in Canada. He is a keynote speaker. He's a breakout speaker. He's a TED talker across North America and the Pacific Rim, and he loves to equip leaders and school teams on observable impact. He's also the co-author of the new book, Words on the Wall, Culturizing Your Classroom for Observable Impact, with our great friend and co-author, Jimmy Casas. Cale Birk, welcome. You've been on the show before, so welcome back to Principal Matters. And I want you to fill in the gaps on that intro and tell listeners something they may be surprised to know what's going on with you now.
Well, I'm still back at how many episodes, Will? That's truly remarkable. And just from a fan's point of view, I'm first of all, I love the podcast. Secondly, it must be just such a pleasure to be able to connect with different people and hear different stories. What a learning opportunity for you. And I'm envious. I hope I can keep the bar at a reasonable standard today.
It is a joy. And you're one of those people, Cale. We've connected offline, we've recorded together. And I've told you this before, but I'm just going to say to listeners, one of the things that I admire about your work so much is how you take the big ideas that we talk about in education and leadership, and then you ask the hard questions, which is, okay, how are you going to measure that? What's the impact of that? How can I observe that? And so here's the part here's the next chapter in our relationship is this new work that you've done with Jimmy Casas. And for listeners who don't know Jimmy, he's the best-selling author of the book Culturize. Jimmy is the owner and CEO of J. Casas and Associates and a well-known speaker across the US, just like you are. And you guys have combined, I don't know, this might be like Avengers or something, like these two superhero educator guys come together and now they're going to combine Culturize and Observable Impact into one book. So take us there. What motivated you guys to collaborate on this book? And then I'm just going to ask the hard question straight up. How can educators measure culture?
This is great. So I need to, I think, push back on your Avengers analogy just slightly. Perhaps Batman and Robin, maybe a little bit more apropos. I think Jimmy's work speaks for itself. And for me to be able to partner with Jimmy on this work was exciting. I learned and have learned a lot from not only writing, but actually watching Jimmy speak and just the way he connects with audiences. And yet pushes people, right? Asks permission, but pushes people to examine their own practice, right? And I think that's really where he and I sort of landed up. Jimmy and I knew each other through Twitter since sort of 2010 when Twitter was cool and people blogged and there was this sort of nice educational tone about it. And then met personally a few years ago just at some different events. And I was reading Culturize and I had written about observable impact. And a question that I had as thinking and putting my leader and school leader or even district leader cap on is so with the core principles, how could we make it so that people could actually think, now I know what this looks like, and more importantly, leads to in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So I was sitting in my car and I thought, you know what, I'm going to phone Jimmy and chat with him about this. And we ended up talking for, I don't know, an hour and a half. And by the end, we're like, I think we might need to write something about this. And that was really exciting because I think, the success of Culturize has been wonderful. I also think and I don't know if you agree, Will, we're at a point in time where I think culture is being put to the test. What I mean by that is that, there are people that are, how would I say this? Going into leadership positions is becoming less attractive for people at certain points. Certainly, some of the districts that I've worked with, they're looking at 2/3 to 3/4 of their leadership population being within their first 5 years of education, never mind teaching, and they're already in leadership positions. And I think it's really about starting to change the narrative. And that to me is if we could start to granularize a little bit more what culture leads to in our classrooms so that it drives our work. Jimmy and I thought this was just a real opportunity to extend the work of Culturize. And I see this as the book as a I don't want to call it a sequel. It rides shotgun with Culturize because as we know, and I think you'd agree, well, a lot of principals go, okay, I get it, but how do I do it? And when I'm doing it well, what should I look for in our schools? And that's to me what was really exciting is starting to look at each of those 4 core principles and go, okay, so how do we help people develop their own framework? A key caveat though for the book, and that Jimmy and I wanted to be very cautious of, is we suggest a model and a framework. And the framework is a useful way to start to granularize some of those big terms. However, we never want to tell people this is what your culture should look like and lead to. I think there's a lot of books out there that sort of direct people that this is what it should look like. And yet we know, I think one of the most important things that an organization can do is start to develop that culture from the inside out, if that makes sense. And so while we gave a framework to folks, we wanted to make sure that we weren't saying, you should do what Jimmy and Cale say. It's more, here's a way that you can do it so that you have ownership over your own culture. And I think that was the motivation for us to collaborate on the book. And it's been a wild ride ever since.
I like so many things you just said, Cale, that I want to reflect on. And I agree, culture is being put to the test in so many different ways than we ever expected. It's odd when you feel like you've seen it all, and then you wake up and realize every single day you see something you've not seen before. And I think school leaders have always had that experience, and I think education leaders, that will always be the way that it is. So thank you for that perspective of you and Jimmy aren't trying to, in this book, dictate what your culture should look like, but what you're asking is, how do you take those frameworks of what we know are the evidence of good culture, and then how do we, and this is where I want to just lean into your expertise, Cale. How do you actually know that those principles are existing? And so I love it that you took the 4 principles of Culturize. And I'm going to ask you to use this example from the book, which is your culture checkpoints. And so to talk about how that was a helpful way for you to take those ideas and turn them into a framework for or a lens in which to look at your school to see how are we actually doing.
Well, I'll start a little bit with a story. I was driving home with my daughter about 4 or 5 months ago, and the book was in progress. And my daughter asked me, she says, of course, I still don't know that my children know what I do, but because they're sort of in their own worlds. But she's like, Dad, I hear you're writing a book with Jimmy. That's neat. And I said, yeah, that's great. She said, what's it called? And I said, well, right now we're thinking it's going to be called Words on the Wall. And right away, she looked at me and she said, we have lots of words on the wall at our school, but we don't do those things. And I looked at her and I said, I'm so glad you just said that, because to me, then the title lands. Because and I mean this, I love my daughters, but they're teenagers. They're in their world, but they're in the school world and they see those words everywhere on the buildings. So I think the piece for me that we need to do is everyone says they're doing things, and we're working hard, but it doesn't necessarily pass what I would call, and we refer to in the book, the teenager test. And the teenager test to me is this. And I'm picking on my daughters and I love them, but let's say that my youngest daughter had lost her phone, which I'm sure has never happened for you and your family. But there are a few things that cause more angst in the Birk household than when one of our children can't find their phone. And so if Kate comes running to me and says, "Dad, I need to find my phone. Where's my phone?" And I turn to her and say, "Kate, you need to be resilient." Kate's response right away would be, "I am resilient." And without qualifying what we mean by resilience, anyone can say that. But if I say to Kate, a resilient student is someone who makes multiple attempts and uses multiple strategies when they encounter a challenge, Kate would go, "Oh no, I'm not resilient at all." And she'd start laughing. My point is with words such as I'll just use one example, being a champion for students. Very quickly, any of us can, and probably rightfully would say, "Well, I am a champion for students." And what we ask the reader to do in the book is think, okay, let's assume that you are a champion for students. If you were truly being a champion for students, not what would that look like, but what would that lead to for students? In other words, if I truly was being a champion for students, I would notice that my students were doing more of blank. And suddenly, now we can pass the teenager test, because now someone can't just say, "Well, I am a champion for students, Dad." Instead, they're saying, "I'm a champion for students when I see my students doing more of blank." For example, if I was truly being a champion for students and understanding their stories and trying to create positive experiences for them, then one of the observables I might see from my students, one of the culturized checkpoints might be that more of my students are willing to share their individual stories about their context. So what we're doing is we're saying, let's all agree that we want to be champions for students, but then let's start to think about, if we truly were being champions for students, what would that lead to for students? And then use what that would lead to, more of my students sharing their individual stories and context, use that to drive what it would look like for me as a teacher. Because if I truly, and there's a word, and I want to give a shout out to a friend of mine, Brenna, who is a coordinator of inclusive education in a district here in British Columbia. She said to me, "Cale, try not to use the word all, try to use the word each." And I love that, because each just makes you think of every student in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So if we truly wanted each of our students to be able to share their individual stories, well, now it makes us think, boy, as a teacher, I wonder how I could get each of my students. I might have to give them different opportunities, different choices at different times. In other words, we're using what it leads to drive what it looks like, and the tasks and activities that we would see in the classroom. So truly, what we wanted to do, Will, is to make sure that we can all pass the teenager test. And we also have two other tests, which is the civilian test, which is we speak a language, of course, that many of our friends who are not in education go, "What are you talking about?" So we need to make sure that anyone can observe these things. And we also say we want it to pass the new teacher test. And the new teacher test is that, can it actually be done? Remember when you were a new teacher, if we just throw all the things at the new teacher and say, "This is what you have to do," it can't be too much. It has to be doable. So that was really our approach, Will, was to take these big ideas and break them, start with what it would lead to and what we would see with our kids, and then have it work backwards from there.
I'm so glad you said that. I want to pause and say two things and follow up. One, some of my listeners may or may not know that Principal Matters, the editor for the show is my oldest daughter, Emily, who's also now my executive assistant for the show. And so, Cale, I'm going to embarrass her because she's editing the show as we're speaking. She's sitting here taking notes, and she does know what it feels like to lose a cell phone. So I'm just going to throw that out there. But the second thing I want to say, sorry, Emily. The second thing that I want to say is, when you talk about passing, does this pass the teenager test, or does this pass the civilian test, or does this pass the new teacher test? You are so right on, because kids can smell BS. And so all these things, all these, big words we use, or all these promises that we make, or all these things that we say. Um, but I would say most of us can smell BS too when we're sitting in PD, or when in a
Yep.
staff meeting, or when we're at some kind of assembly. And so those things that we just say over and over and over again, all students can learn. They become empty unless you're actually able to measure. Well, show me how that's actually happening. So I want to just pause for a second, because you're just inspiring me to think about this example too in my own work. I've developed some statements that I like to do as a self-assessment, and some of these came from also from reflecting on Jimmy's work too. And so I'm just going to read four of the statements out loud because they're helpful for me, and there's something I do with leaders on a regular basis where I'll say, "All right, just on a scale from 1 to 5, rate yourself on the following statements. Statement 1: I've been visible with every student, every teacher, every day. Statement 2: I've been listening to or reading or meditating on helpful books or lessons. Statement 3: I've been making healthy choices in my sleep, nutrition, exercise. Statement 4: I've been faithful to my loved ones with my time and attention." And the goal of those statements is to push me or anyone else that's using them to then ask the question, is this passing the BS? Is this passing that test? Because if it's really, when you take those intentions and you turn them into observable measurements, then suddenly you have to get real. So, man, Cale, this is so glad that you guys have have done this. I want to ask you, feel free to respond to that before I ask my next question.
Well, I think the question that we can add to augment what we're saying is if I'm visible, to borrow one of those phrases,
Mhm.
what will I observe from my students as a result? And I think
Mhm.
that's a different question. And what that does, because I could want, as a leader, and gosh, it's so busy, and leader, teacher, that we think, okay, I need to be visible. So we're running into classrooms, and I used to sometimes play fun uncle and go into the biology class and pull on the frog's legs and see how the kids were doing and all that sort of stuff. And so one might say I was visible, but when we're so busy, what's the purpose of our visibility? And if we
Mhm.
truly were visible, what would we want to see from our students, from our educators, and from the tasks, activities, and assessments in a classroom? Because we hear about this concept of leadership versus management. I think it's a red herring. I think we have to think of leadership through management and leadership during management. So we have to be very, I think, purposeful in defining, because truly, even if we were, in quotes, visible, if it's not leading to me to demonstrable changes that we see in the classroom, it's a nice thing. And sure, we love to see our principal in the hallway. But I hope that we can start to say, you know what, if I'm visible in my school, these are 2 or 3 things I'd like to observe more frequently in my students, my educators, and what I'm seeing in the classroom. And you're actually pointing out something, and it's a nice segue, because developing culturized checkpoints, and one of the chapters is it's not a spectator sport. And we talk about what we would see from students, educators, and tasks, but we also talk about, and what's the leadership that would be required to help make that happen. And I think that's critical. We're not saying to students, do these things. We're not saying to students and teachers, hey, you should do these things. We're saying, as leaders, if we truly want our students to be able to share their stories, their unique stories about their individual context, and we want teachers to use multiple modalities in order to get each of their students to do that, then what does a staff meeting look like where we are modeling some of the practices and getting to know our teachers' individual context and having them share their stories? And if we want teachers to individually conference with students, as a leader, what's my role in modeling and actually individually conferencing with my educators so I understand their stories? So we're very clear that it's not just, hey, they should. And I think this is one of the things when we see behavior matrices, for example, you'll see them around schools. I've always found those puzzling, Will, because if behavior matrices do not have an adult and a task component, I don't understand them, because all they are is a bigger, bolder set of expectations for what we want from kids. Of course, we want kids to walk down the hall and be polite and empathetic to their peers. The question becomes, but what's my role as an educator to make that happen? And what are the activities that are going to allow my children to practice these skills? So what I hope is that for all those folks out there that are working, for example, on behavior matrices, which is, laudable, I think this is a different approach that actually has us take that sort of matrix approach and make it more 3 and 4 dimensional, so that it's not just student, it's educator, it's the activities in the classroom, and what we do as leaders to help create that. The challenge, Will, is in truth, it's more work. But I think what it is, it leads to the culture that we want to see, because it says that all of us, each of us, there, I caught myself. Thank you, Brenna. Each of us has a role to play.
Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. Everyone talks about the power of data-driven instruction, but what does that actually look like? Look no further than IXL, the ultimate online learning and teaching platform for K-12. IXL gives you meaningful insights that drive real progress, and research can prove it. Studies in nearly all 50 states show that schools that use IXL outperform other schools on state tests. Educators who use IXL love that they can easily see how their school is performing in real time to make better instructional decisions. And IXL doesn't stop at just data. IXL also brings an entire ecosystem of resources for your teachers, with a complete curriculum, personalized learning plans, and so much more. It's no wonder that IXL is used in 95 of the top 100 school districts. Ready to join them? Visit ixl.com/PM to get started. Hi, friends. Did you know that Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, has been downloaded over 1.5 million times? We are so proud to share conversations, interviews, and resources to support leaders like you who are serving school communities worldwide. And I'd like to invite you to explore our books, our professional development offerings, our Grow Academies, our masterminds, executive coaching, and keynote presentations, because we're here to help you and your teams build schools that you're proud to call home. So here's my question. How are you planning to keep growing in the semester ahead? We're booking events right now for the next 2 years, and we would love to serve you in person or virtually. So visit williamdparker.com and click services, or email me at will@williamdparker.com to connect. I would love to hear from you. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's show.
You're listening to Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast.
Well, what I appreciate about your work, Cale, is you don't only challenge fellow educators to think about how they can actually measure observable impact, but you do a lot of work to help us learn how to do that as well. I love it that you push back on some of those observable statements that I quoted by asking that follow-up question: if I am visible, what will I observe from my students and teachers as a result? Because there's always that next question that leads you to that deeper understanding and that better application. Can you talk a little bit about layering change and why it's so important to, as you guys in the book say, decrease the distance between the implementation and actually the experience?
Well, in truth, I wrote a book. I don't think anyone ever read it years ago, called Changing Change Using Learner-Centered Design. And it struck me years ago that if change is one of the most difficult things that we do, then why don't we change the experience of change? In other words, you hear there's, how many books have been written about change and change theory and all this sort of stuff. And it strikes me that we can write every approach that we want, but maybe we actually have to look at the experience of change for adults and for kids too. But, in our context, I'm thinking about our educators and our leaders. And I think that what ends up happening a lot of the time is that, even well-meaning solutionitis, where we tend to solve the problem in absence of those who are going to be using the solution. And so layering change to me, I think, and I wrote about this in Drift, and we certainly brought this across, I think, a little bit in Words on the Wall, was that layering change is really about changing the user experience of change by co-creating with people. And I think one of the pieces that's vital when we talk about checkpoints is first of all, co-creating checkpoints is hard. I want to rephrase that. It's challenging, but it's funny when I work with people about observables. It's not out of the realm of possibility. It's you, and I love what you said, Will. It's asking the extra question. It's asking the one more question that makes us all go, wait a minute, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that way. And what I've found with districts that I've worked with for in a number of years is they become quite well versed in being able to make things observable and ask, I wonder what I would notice or if I'm thinking of the most resilient student, what would I see in them? They start to create those phrases to start to change their thinking about how they can arrive at that. But by doing this with the staff, this is how we layer, is that we start to, it's a formative process. And what Jimmy and I try and, when we're doing our workshops and things like that, is we talk to folks about, okay, what are the skills? If you were to create the culturized checkpoints that were highly observable, they met the teenager test, the civilian test, the new teacher test, what are all the skills that you as a staff would have to do and demonstrate to do this? Well, they would say, well, we're collaborating, we're thinking critically, we're challenging each other respectfully, we're thinking about what this feels like, we're adapting, we're applying, and they're naming all these higher order skills. And I'll write them just as fast as I can. And then I'll talk to them about, imagine that you were on a staff where people were respectfully challenging, critically thinking, analyzing, applying. Is that not a staff that you wouldn't want to be a part of? Does that not even say something in its own culture? And then I want to take that one level down and go, and now if we're doing that for and with our students, then to me, this is the school that we want to be a part of. So I think the layering of the change, co-creation is a big piece of it, and starting small and starting with maybe one of the culturized checkpoints, but saying, if there were one that we could work on that would make the biggest difference for our students, what's that one that as a staff we might want to work on, or as a team that we might want to work on, and co-create that together so it makes it doable, but yet we're making demonstrable progress towards that. And that's really what we mean by layering change. Is I think that we need to differentiate for our adults in the same way that we want to differentiate for our students. We need to recognize and hear their stories, where they're from. And by having them a part of the process, one of the things, and you've seen this too, Will, in your work, where well-meaning leaders run through the process of creating whatever it is, the behavior matrix, the culturized checkpoints, the vision, the mission. And we do that because we say our teachers are so busy, I just want to take it off their plate. But in fact, we're robbing ourselves of a formative opportunity to understand, where are our staff, where are our teachers at, and how can we layer that change for them? So that's really where that came from.
You're reminding me of a conversation I had the other day with a leader who is in a leadership position where they're responsible for analyzing student data, reporting back to the board, and this leader was presenting that work to colleagues, and one of those colleagues, after seeing areas where students were deficient, just responded with the question, well, what are you going to do about that now, to this leader? And that leader had brought that question to me, just trying to think through what are the next best steps. And it's interesting, Cale, because we went through kind of a thought experiment together in terms of let's take yourself back to your classroom years. What would you have done in that moment if this was happening in your own classroom? And then translate that. What would this look like if you were trying to do this at a building level? And now you're looking at this larger scope across an entire learning community. And it was interesting because where we ended up landing was on the question, if you could have the outcome that you want, what would it look like? And that question brought it full circle back around to this leader recognizing that when someone asks the question, what are you going to do about that? In this leader's experience, the answer became, actually, I need to sit down with the people involved and ask them for their input so that together we can begin to imagine what are the outcomes that we want, and let's collaboratively figure out these solutions together. Instead of me trying to individually dream up the solution, we're going to do what you do in the old-fashioned classroom setting, Cale. We're gonna enter this struggle together, and then we're gonna discover the solution together. And so, I don't know if that resonates with you, but when I hear you talk about this, it just brings me back to that's the difference between words on the wall and and actually practicing what education, the cycles of education, and what they should look like for meaningful outcomes. So. Let me let you respond to that before I wrap up with a final question.
Well, and I think that that's the difference between words on the wall and observable impact. And that's really what we were talking about. There's two pieces that are interesting to me, very interesting in terms of what you said. Number one is for example, I think culture can be weaponized, meaning we have a bad culture and Will, it's your fault. You've created this, the decisions you've made. Our community can say that. And I think when someone says, hey, how are you going to solve X, whatever that is that we're talking to the leader, I think a useful start point is what you're saying is if X were solved, what would that lead to? And co-creating that with people. For example, when people say, our culture is broken, I always gently say, okay, I think before we talk about that, I think we need to come to a common understanding about what we mean by culture, because I can't really respond to that until we have what that looks like. And so that's where I use that sort of inverted Y process of student, educator, task, and go, if we truly had a positive culture, what would we not only notice from students, but what would we notice from educators, from the activities and assessments in the classroom, and what would we know from leaders? So that's number one. And number two, when you were mentioning your friend who brought some data and evidence forward, and the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? I think there's another set of evidences that we need to look at. And I think, we characterize it in the book as lagging and leading indicators. I think a lot of the times we focus on lagging indicators, and another version of lagging indicators would be what I might call educational box scores, sort of what we see at the end. And I think because we focus so much on those, we can tend to just sort of run around and try and find a solution. Whereas when we have a co-created vision of what culture or even academic success looks like, we're not only looking at the lagging indicators, which is in many ways what we see from students. They're the end product. The students' reading scores, math scores, whatever it is, or even some of whether they're empathetic or those things that we might see in those one-dimensional behavior matrices. What I'm more interested in is if that's what we're seeing in the classroom, I wonder why. And in other words, if I wanted to lose weight, I might look at how many belt loops I'm going to go down, or maybe I'm measuring, or if I'm really sophisticated, I might use calipers and sort of some of those other measures. But those are all lagging indicators. The leading indicators to me are, am I getting exercise? Am I trying to eat relatively healthy? Am I perhaps on a weight training or a yoga program? And I think we would all agree that if I'm not willing to do the running, the cardio, whatever that is, the eating properly, then in other words, if I'm not looking at the frequency of leading indicators, then it really should come as no surprise. Now, some of us, I guess, out there are fortunate. They don't have to worry about some of those things. They're just naturally fit and all that sort of stuff. But I think this is what we need to do as well, is when we are starting to present evidence, I think we need to look at evidence of the lagging indicators. Yes, that's a flashlight for us, but another flashlight is how frequently are we seeing adults do these things? How frequently are we seeing these types of assessments? And how frequently are the leaders doing those things from our co-created vision? And that to me, Will, is why it's so important to have each of those people around the table. So when we co-create that vision, it's not just sort of pointing fingers, it's us saying collectively, let's do this. And I don't know if you agree, but one of the biggest mistakes we make with an observable vision is that we have the vision, but we don't use the vision. And in many ways, the vision then can't just be of the students. We can go around and determine through our educational box scores where they're at. But how often are we going in and looking at the leading indicators? How often we're doing those things as adults and leaders? So that's how I might approach that challenge is, first of all, that we were talking about is how do we define X? And secondly, let's make sure that we're not just looking at those lagging indicators, the results. We're also looking at the leading indicators, because I think we can actually do more about the leading indicators that would lead to more of the lagging indicators. So that's how I might approach that situation with that leader, using the background that we are in Words on the Wall.
No, I love that. And I'm probably gonna end up stealing that analogy, Cale, because I really want to chew on that. Your leading indicators are the positive actions that you know are going to produce healthier outcomes. Your lagging indicators are those reactive or the results of behaviors that have already happened that often show you, in some cases, the failure or lack of growth or whatever it is that you're concerned about. And you're right, as leaders, a lot of times we spend our time digging into data and trying to respond to the places where we've failed or failed to grow. And what I hear you saying is, that's fine. You need to analyze um, where the gaps are in growth. But just as important, or I would say sometimes even more important, are what are those behaviors that produce the kind of results that you're wanting, and you've got to make sure that those are intentional and deep and meaningful. They can't just be a list of actions that you do on a piece of paper, or you show up in a meeting and you go through the checklist. But these are, I'm sorry, I'm just thinking of a garden analogy. Like, you and I could both know that to grow a great garden, you need good soil, you need fertile soil, you need to be able to keep the weeds out, you need to have good sunlight and water it a lot. Well, those are leading indicators. But I could buy a bag of soil and dig up a spot in the ground, stick it there, put some seeds in, and then water it and hope it's going to turn out fine. But I'm probably going to do a whole lot better if I actually have understood the components of a good garden better, like maybe composting, or maybe making sure that I've placed the right kinds of seed in the area for sun or shade, or maybe that I'm watering it at the right times, not just watering it, daily, but watering at the right times. Or and so those leading indicators are going to give me a way higher probability that my garden's going to turn out okay than just watching it die and then spending all my time studying the death. So I don't know if that analogy helps, but that's what's going on in my mind.
Well, you're bang on, and this is where in the model in the book, the culturized checkpoint, we call the sort of first checkpoint that we make with our students needs to be directly linked to the teacher action. So it's not we blurt out a bunch of things about what kids should be doing, or we would see from kids if we were being champions for students, and then we blurt out a bunch of things, which is the analogy that you're saying. Of course, soil and all those sorts of things are important, and nutrients and water. But part of it is if we think about specific plants, the actual soil structure that's there, all those different things, when we get into the granularity of what it is, in fact, soil, water, and all those things, the amounts, the different things, it's a lot more nuanced. And I think, in some ways, to borrow from Heifetz, we also have to look at our leading indicators in some ways as experiments, right? That we're saying, you know what, I think that if we truly want each of our students to be able to share their individual stories about their individual context with their peers, we're going to try some different things. Our best hypothesis is we're going to do this. And this is where, when we start to really dig into the work with schools and in creating and then utilizing their culturized checkpoints, is that we try them out. But we try them in such a way that when we are doing them, we create a lot of what we call when-then patterns. When we did this, then this is what we noticed from our students as a result. And now Will and I on a collaborative team might try a few different things, and we come back and go, you know what? We've tried this with 2 different groups. We've tried this over the last couple of months, and we're actually noticing it's not leading to that happening, that lagging indicator at a higher frequency. This is okay, because what it tells us is that we might need to look at something else. In other words, going back to your garden analogy, that we're watering way too much. Like we thought we would just hose it off, and actually everything's floating and it's all dying. We should stop that now. Otherwise, it doesn't pass the teenager test. I do water my garden. Well, of course you do, but it's 6 feet deep with water and everything is underwater. You know what I mean? So I think if we can look at these as sort of experimental, where we're saying, if we try this for this set period of time, then our measure of success is not that we're working really hard, we're trying these things really hard. Our measure of success is, are we seeing those connected lagging indicators at a higher frequency? And you know what, Will, I find even as I'm saying this, I make it sound in some ways harder than it is. It's not. It's actually just being really specific about what it would lead to, and then being cognizant of the actions that we have that might lead to that at a higher frequency. And I think that as we start to create what we might say is a 4D high resolution picture of what each of the culturized checkpoints and core principles looks like, I think what it does, it gives us a chance. It gives us a chance to have great conversations with each other. It gives, imagine, I see those matrices in schools, and it's all about students. It's students' will, and when we're walking in the halls, we'll be good in the bathroom and won't turn the water on and all that stuff, or whatever it is. But wouldn't it be nice if our students saw that actually this is what we're going to do as educators, and this is what leaders are going to do, and this is what it's going to look like. These are why we're going to use these types of assessments and tasks. And wouldn't it be interesting if our kids said, hey, you know what? One of the things that we said is that we develop, we are champions for students at our school. But right now we notice that we're not doing these things very often. At some point, if we say that culture is everyone's responsibility, doesn't it make sense that all of us have that common North Star that we've co-created that fits our school, that we can actually point to, so that we move beyond words on the wall to actual impact that we can all observe? And to me, if our kids can observe it, if my daughter says we have lots of words on the wall and we don't do that, that's on us. And I think we can do something about it. And I hope this book gives people hope, because it says, wait a minute, culture is important, but this is what I can actually do. And that's, to me, what's most exciting.
Well, Principal Matters listeners, I want you to check out the book, Words on the Wall, Culturizing Your Classroom for Observable Impact by Cale, Birk, and Jimmy Casas. And Cale, in just a moment, I want you to let listeners know how they can stay connected with you. But I just want to say this as we wrap up, because I know you and I love to just explore all the nuances of our thinking. But this book is chock full of just really practical applications. So let me just give you one example from the chapter on Champions for Students, where you create just a short assessment. And so if you check out this book, you're going to find examples of ways that the kinds of questions you can be asking when you're evaluating the behavior of students or of yourself and other educators, or what kinds of tasks and assessments. So Cale, with your permission, I'm just going to read one section here on your Champions for Students. This is on page 51 in the book. You create standards, and for standard one for students, how do we know we have at our school we are champions for students? Well, one, we should see students sharing their thinking and understanding in different ways through discussions, writings, presentations, or using technology. How do we know our educators are being champions for students in that standard? Well, they will be using various ways to allow students to choice in how they demonstrate their understanding and thinking. How do we know that the right classroom tasks and assessments are being used for that standard? Well, we're allowing students to show their learning in more than one way, choice boards or digital student portfolios or presentation-based assessments. That's the nitty gritty. You can get, and that's just a very small example of what you guys have unpacked through so many great resources. So thank you for the ways that you and Jimmy have combined these worlds of, man, let's make these the most healthy cultures we can for our schools. And at the same time, let's keep it real. How do we actually observe and measure those outcomes too? So Cale, as we wrap up, any parting words you want to leave with listeners, and how can people stay connected with you and find this book?
Well, I think just in the end, I hope that in a time when, and I really believe that culture is so important in our schools, I think people want they want a positive culture. They do. This, I hope, provides people with thoughts, ideas, and practical strategies. I'm kind of a technician that way. Well, like I just think about that teacher that's out there that's overwhelmed and got all this stuff, and leaders that are overwhelmed, and district leaders. I hope that we break the concepts down in such a way that people go, I think we have a chance. And that's, to me, if we can start to move through that, and that's some of that efficacy piece where we can start to say, you know what, if we just start to chip away at this, then we actually have a chance to further the culture in our building and make it lasting and sustainable. So that's really what I'm hoping that people get from the book. And I'm just excited when you've got someone like Jimmy, who is such a prolific speaker and just has a way of putting that out there. And then hopefully for me, as someone who likes to get into the weeds a little bit and likes to really sit and marinate in some of the thinking behind it, I hope it's just accessible for people. And I hope it's fun too. We tried to write it in such a way that people could see what it could look like through a collaborative team perspective, and lots of thoughts flowing around, lots of analogies. So I hope people enjoy the book. I don't, sometimes, Will, I don't know if you find this, if you write a book and afterwards you're like, nah, I actually like this. Like, this was maybe the first book I've been a part of that I felt like this is okay. So I'm sort of excited now. Who knows what'll happen, but I hope it gives people that bit of hope to say, you know what, we can really chip away at culture. And if people want to buy the book, certainly you can look through Connected Ed Publishing with Jimmy's work. It is also available through Amazon as well. And for me, it's just birklearns.com, and you can probably find me there. And I'd love to connect with people.
Well, Cale, Birk, thank you so much for giving Principal Matters listeners the opportunity to sit in the room with you today. And thank you for this new book, Words on the Wall, Culturizing Your Classroom for Observable Impact, that you can find at connected.org or at Amazon. And we'll put a link in the show notes. But until next time, my friend, thank you for your great work. And Principal Matters listeners, thank you for doing what matters. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, would you take a moment and like, share, subscribe, or leave us a review? In fact, if you share it out with a friend, even more people can become a part of these conversations. Sign up for our newsletter at williamdparker.com for even more free resources. And don't forget to check out our website to learn more about our books, professional development offerings, Grow Academies, masterminds, executive coaching, and keynote presentations. Wow, let's keep learning together. And thank you for doing what matters.
Principal Matters.